Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
Hi, everyone. It's Khalilah-Brown Dean, host of Disrupted. Each week, Disrupted spotlights the changes and changemakers who help us see the world differently and challenge us to grow together. Today, we're listening back to one of our favorite episodes of 2024. It's our conversation with author Amy Tan. I initially expected this conversation to center on Amy's amazing career as an author, to talk about how her books have explored complex relationships and families, to think about identity and representation and how she uses literature to encourage those connections with other people. But what ended up happening was quite different and, dare I say, even more important. Amy Tan reminds us that amid all the uncertainties that we face, as we navigate new disruptions and transitions, as we try to figure it all out, real power comes in knowing that we can just be still. That, my friends, is my hope for you in this new year, that you will embrace that power, that you will be still and know that you are entitled to every good thing. Here's my conversation with author Amy Tan. Amy Tan is best known for popular novels like The Joy Luck Club and its 1993 film adaptation.
My mother died 4 months ago. I realized for the first time they wanted me to take my mother's place. So I sat down on the east, where things begin, with my mother's best friends.
The book and movie explore several mother-daughter relationships, some of which were shaped by Amy's own experiences. Amy's latest book is The Backyard Bird Chronicles. This time it hits close to home in a different way. In the book, Amy brings the birds in her backyard to life with humor and tragedy through observations and drawings from her nature journals. But this book isn't just a recounting of wildlife. The author vividly imagines the bird's inner thoughts and comes away with piercing observations about wildlife, humanity, and the relationship between them. This is Disrupted. I'm Khalilah-Brown Dean. Today we're talking with Amy Tan about her new book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles, and how being in nature allows her to reflect on everything from racism to the beauty of connection. Amy, welcome to Disrupted.
Good to be here.
You talk about in your own work that from a very young age, you wanted to be an artist, that there was this connection that drew you in. What is it about art that connects with you and has connected to you for so long?
One is that I can do that in solitude. And as a child, even, I loved being by myself in my room, having privacy and being away from family chaos. And the other part of it is that, as with reading when I was a child, art, drawing was something very free. I could just do this. Nobody was telling me how to do it. And I loved it for that reason.
You have this moment in the preface to the book where you talk about your childhood, of where you lived and how it allowed you to connect with nature, but that it also allowed you to be free. And that sense of freedom comes through in so many of your stories. How do you navigate freedom in spaces that want to define what that looks like for you? But you also talk about being out and exploring. Share with our listeners some of that exploration in those early years of nature.
I remember vividly when I was about 8 years old, I lived in Santa Rosa, and about a block from our house was a creek. And I remember it as being a huge, steep creek, but it was probably a little trickle if I were to see it now. I would climb down the banks and I would go into the little puddles and I would look at pollywogs, for example, and I would watch them grow over time. And I would catch salamanders, snakes, things that crawled on the ground. And I somehow never looked up at the sky to notice birds. But I loved nature. I wasn't afraid of it like a lot of people are these days. They hate snakes, but I loved that kind of thing. They were mysterious creatures. They were different. They were right there.
I want to share with our listeners this passage from your book because it was so vivid that as I was reading it, I imagined my own childhood, that sense of exploration beyond boundaries, of no one saying what girls should and shouldn't do, or being concerned about getting dirty, but being able to really explore. You talk about this experience where you slip and a rusty nail gouges your knee. And you write, I still have that 1 inch diameter scar on the side of my knee, which I have unconsciously rubbed so often over the years. I have made threadbare spots on many of my pants. The scar remains a badge of bravery and disobedience, a memento of my childhood when I made discoveries on my own, one so exciting they overrode caution. That sense of wonder that children have, that unabandoned sense of connection, still seems to permeate through your writing. How do you connect with that sense of disobedience and defiance that allows Amy Tan to say, this is who I am and how I show up?
One is that I have a pledge to myself to always discover something new as I get older. So it doesn't matter how old I am. And I'm like that child who still needs to discover something. And so that in itself, having that be a conscious, intentional goal, means that I do have to overcome certain possible fears, cautions, practical advice. I, for example, for many years was scared of sharks. I couldn't imagine going into the water, into the ocean. But then I realized there's all this fascinating life below the water. And now I go places where I can just snorkel to see sharks. I swim among sharks. I swim right next to them. I've swum into a circle of them going around me, babies, teenagers, adults. Um, and it's so incredible. It's such a high. And once you have that high, it's hard to, stay away from it.
There is a sense of excitement that just washed over your face as you were talking about that, of being
Exactly.
in a space that's supposed to be scary.
I'm remembering the first time I saw a shark and being really scared, and then later swimming next to this gigantic whale shark, and that was about 20 feet long, and just being thrilled because the shark was looking at me and I was looking at the shark. Same thing that I feel when I look at a bird. They look at me as I'm looking at them, and it's that connection. It feels like a very privileged connection to wildlife, especially when they don't take off immediately when they see you looking at them.
Before we get more into talking about your new book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles, one of the things that I think can be a challenge for people who write and create is that it is so deeply personal. You invest so much of your time and yourself into the work that, for me anyway, it becomes frightening to release that and share that into the world. And you have talked about the challenge with perfectionism and this sort of perfection syndrome. How do you work through that to create these pieces that, as you say, allow you to see and respect the beauty of nature that's around you every day?
Well, for one thing, it was always meant to be private. So right there, I had only the perfection syndrome that applied to myself, looking at my work as the critic. I eventually realized that this was something I had to overcome because it was affecting me in writing fiction. I was always stymied, especially with the thought that this would become public. I imagined all the flaws, the humiliation, the bad reviews, the editor having a very disappointed face. And I had to get over that because that didn't happen. So I started to post some of my drawings and comments on a nature journal page on Facebook, but I did allow myself a pseudonym. So nobody would say, oh my God, that's Amy Tan. Look how horrible her little drawings are. Why did she think she could post that here? Everybody there was so encouraging to anybody, especially if you said, I'm a rank beginner. I've never done this. I'm a little nervous. Everybody seems so great here. And you'd get tons of encouragement from people. So it was a non-critical platform. It was very embracing. And I was just this anonymous person named Unmay Tan. and I could do that. And it was great sharing with people, but it was still very private. I didn't share all of them. And I had a thrill sharing discoveries with people, not just my own, but reading about theirs. And it just opened up my mind in a way I never imagined. Opening your mind to questions, becoming a child and not assuming you know everything, being able to state these, what seems like very obvious questions or questions you wouldn't ask because the answers were so obvious and they weren't. So that right there, the discovery of all that was enough to override these concerns that I shouldn't do this because, I worried about perfection.
I imagine it also allows you a space to just be, to just be yourself, to just pursue the interests you have without having the
Yes.
pressure of who is the person.
Now, it was a problem in a way because after a while, I loved doing this so much that I wasn't writing my novel. There were a lot of things going on, and this was like a little refuge for me to just draw. And I was doing this. It wasn't hard work at all. It was pure joy. Hours would go by without my realizing it until the sunset. So I could do this from morning until I couldn't see these birds anymore in my yard because it was night. And then I would continue drawing them, based on photos I'd taken, the very realistic kinds of portraits. And that became a part of it too. So it was an obsession in a way, just born out by intense curiosity and the love that I was finally drawing. I was finally doing art that I dreamt about as a child. And yeah, it was all consuming, but it had that detrimental effect of not keeping me focused on my other job, my other work, my other passion. Yeah. But there were reasons for that too. We were in strange times when I started, starting with the campaigns, the presidential campaigns. A lot of racism had broken out, overt racism. It had always been there, but it made me realize that a lot of it had been under the surface. And now it was as though people had permission to say whatever they wanted. And I was getting hit with that. And I always had some of it, go back to where you came from kind of stuff. But this was different. This felt dangerous. I felt very vulnerable and I needed to get away from that. I do have to say this, when it started happening, it came in the way of, for example, being ghosted, and people would be served. Everyone would be served except for me repeatedly. I had to ask, could I have a glass of water? I, and it was so disconcerting. I kept saying, well, she's forgetful or he's having a bad day. And after a while, I couldn't say that. The first thing that came to mind was racism. And it was so dehumanizing. And I have to tell you, I understood much more for the first time what Black Americans have gone through all their lives, every day practically. And it was the suspicion that people were racist that was really bothering me, that I couldn't assume people were having a bad day, and maybe they were. But that's what came to mind. And I had to get away from that thought, especially when COVID came around and Asians were being targeted for having caused this pandemic. So it was visceral.
One of the challenges of contending with racism is that we who are targeted or affected by it, as you just mentioned, start to try to rationalize, well, what did we do? Or am I being overly sensitive?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And so it shifts the burden from the
Yeah.
person who is making you uncomfortable to you as the person. And the other
Yeah.
thing that happens, Amy, is we try to find a respite. We try to find a space where, again, we can
Yep.
just be, but we can be reminded of beauty. And it sounds
Yeah.
like watching birds does that for you.
It takes you completely out of what's ugly in the world. One part of it is that you're there in the moment. How rare is it for us to be in the moment, conscious of every little thing going on in the moment? We're thinking of the past, the things that had happened in the past, things that we're worried about. Then we're thinking of the future. Constantly these goals, what we have to do, the daily thing. But when I am watching birds, whether it's in the backyard or out with friends, you're just there. You're not thinking of anything else. And it's beautiful and surprising, constantly surprising. You just are taken aback by the beauty of everything and everything that's new. So there's no way you can be thinking about anything else. I think it's something that many people who watch birds or nature feel, and that's why they have this absolute need to go back into nature from time to time to refresh themselves, to block out what is negative going on in their lives, the constant worries. You just need it for however long, a few minutes, an hour, a day, to get your perspective on life back onto a different track.
I grew up in the South, and it was critical to my grandparents that we spend time outside with our feet firmly on the ground to be able to make that connection to the earth, but to look up and to see the sky and imagine life beyond where we were. You talk in the book about your backyard as being this place where you can observe, you can be connected, you can develop this profound respect for nature while still trying to figure out, how do I attract and feed these birds and counter the very acrobatic squirrels who I'm contending with in my own backyard? Describe your backyard for our listeners and what it means for you as the space for connection.
Well, first of all, you have to realize it's a very small space, and yet it was big. It was the whole world when I was outside, just sitting out there. The patio itself is about 10 by 15. And then there's a fence, and it has a trellis of jasmine, little pots of plants, chair, and the very ugly bird stand that has a lot of homemade feeders on there, other kinds of feeders. It looks like the kind of thing you put washing machines on your front lawn that don't work anymore. It's not attractive. And birds, particular birds, are attracted to different kinds of habitat. So I get the kinds of birds that like trees, oak trees in particular, as squirrels like those too. So you can count on getting a certain kind of bird. And then when other birds come in, it's very exciting. In the beginning, all I saw were crows, a hummingbird, and what I call the blue jay. Blue jays do not happen on the West Coast. They are not there. Blue jays live on the East Coast, or at least east of the Mississippi. So I started seeing more birds, and the other bird I saw was an oak titmouse, which lives in oak trees. So it was discovering my neighbors at the same time. These little neighbors had always been there and would come over. I do have to say that I cannot go outdoors easily to other areas unless I have my husband drive me. He's very understanding and would take me to those places, and has. But, when you want to go to that place every single day, it's a little bit of an imposition to ask your husband to take you 20 miles to a park or something. I have epilepsy, and so I can't drive. And, thank God I discovered that I don't have to go anywhere. I can just go to my yard, can look outside and see all this life going on. And I was oblivious to it for all those years. I can't believe it that I never looked at it.
Coming up, more with author Amy Tan. She talks about seeing herself in the birds she draws. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Khalilah-Brown Dean. This hour, we're talking with best-selling author Amy Tan about her newest book, The Backyard Bird Chronicles. It's a collection of observations and drawings from her nature journals. There is a deep vulnerability to the journal entries in this book. In one section, Amy Tan talks about finding a sick bird called a pine siskin and how it makes her reflect on mortality. I asked Amy about the emotion behind that moment.
For me, it was this discovery of how it wasn't rare that wildlife birds die. I just had never seen them. A lot of people say, where do these birds go? If they're dying in such great numbers, why don't we see this? And so the first time that I saw this bird on my feeder, I thought it was a little baby bird. It was all fluffy and it had flown a great distance. It was sleepy-eyed, was hungry. And then I saw that its backside was very messy and that it really wasn't eating. It was just all this food was he wasn't able to swallow, and it flew and landed on me. And then I knew something was wrong. That bird had a disease that is common in large numbers of finches, and it was going to die within the day. The fluffiness was because it couldn't thermoregulate anymore. I didn't know any of this. I just saw this bird that I realized was going to die. I'd called up U.S. Fish and Wildlife to find out what this was. And I was so heartbroken. I took down the feeder and just all the feeders. I had about 12 of them. I took them all down and I said, I'll never do this again. I can't stand to look at birds dying. And then I read a fact that 75% of birds never make it to adulthood, never make it to that period when they will be breeding. And that was astonishing. Same with hawks, same, with a lot of birds. And this is something that is a fact of life. Now, one of the discoveries, it being in nature, is that this is not just about appreciating beauty and then suddenly, being devastated by the death of a single bird. It was recognition in myself of the questions I have about mortality or my feelings about mortality. I'm a writer, so I think about death every day. And it's not with dread. It's with this fascination that here I am in a vivid life, and that people around me are very vivid, talking, have emotions. I have emotions about them, and they will be gone one day. We'll be gone one by one. We're leaving the party. And what does it mean? What does that simple fact of mortality mean in terms of what I do now? And so I'm looking at these birds and I'm recognizing now that so much about bird life, what they do, their behavior is all about survival. And then I think about people and people in circumstances who are in peril, people in other parts of the world that are experiencing war, terrorism, persecution, and that their lives too are about conscious survival every single day. I have the luxury of being in a country where I don't have to think about it 24 hours a day. But I'm looking at this now, very aware of the nature of survival. I also had to confront questions of morality. So when I'm looking at wildlife and I'm seeing that, say, a mealworm is being eaten by a bird, there's a mealworm that I bought for the bird, and the mealworms are now being eaten by yellow jackets while they're still alive. And the yellow jackets are preventing the birds from eating. So what do I do to the yellow jackets? I get a yellow jacket trap and I trap these yellow jackets. And then I see the yellow jackets struggling and other yellow jackets coming. And I've read they recognize faces And I'm thinking they're saying things like, Betty, Betty, hang on, we're going to get you. We're going to find a way. And I felt bad. And I thought, gosh, I've never felt bad for a lot of creatures I don't see, ants you might step on, or all these creatures that die. And I think my compassion has been kind of phylogenetically based. It's like, where are they on the food chain? I don't have to have compassion for these creatures I don't see, or get smashed, or you kill them because they're annoying. And that was a moral question. Where is my line for compassion? And I thought about in terms of other people and races, and where does our compassion stop? When we look at certain people, what are the circumstances where we're saying, well, these ants don't look good in my kitchen. Where do we say these people are coming into our country and they don't look good in our country? So I thought about all of those questions in a very deep way. And I think that's why I love being in nature as well. It moves you to think and feel much more deeply in ways you never thought of. You're not prepared to have these questions come to you, looking at beauty.
And to be open to that, to be open to the continuous learning. I'm thinking, Amy, of something you said a little while ago about starting this journey during an election where things were very divisive, very ugly. How do you think that this connection with nature, this connection to birding, can help you or help others as we move through these political divisions and embracing the things that you talked about of empathy and compassion, understanding mortality and morality when so much seems uncertain? How does nature help there?
You hope that no matter what our political divides might be, that people in general love nature, that there's a commonality there, a feeling of spirituality that has nothing to do with different religions, for example, and that this is a chance to celebrate that commonality, to remind ourselves we have that commonality. When I'm in a birding group or a group of birders, I can't assume that everybody has my same beliefs about everything else in the world. And that's a good thing. There we are, united in something else. But also, here's another part of it. When you're in nature, you feel a kind of responsibility when you see something happening in nature. For example, that birds are being killed by the billions every year by window collisions or by cats. You feel that you have to speak up. You can't be passive about this. So I've gotten into conservation. And in the same way, you have to feel, connected in whatever your beliefs are and however they come out, whether it's politics or, certain beliefs about spirituality. And you act upon them, but at the same time, you're not doing harm in other ways. You can work on conservation, your beliefs in nature, but you don't do harm. And I think that those are good mottos to live by, that we do no harm. And we can have the differences. We can celebrate our diversity and our differences in opinion. And that makes our civilization very rich, our culture very rich. And we should not strive to limit that. And I would say, both sides of the political divide, we are very divisive and we attack the other side. So that leaves no room, really, in many cases, for coming together with commonality. So I think we need to seek out whatever that commonality can be found. Nature is one. I can't imagine, politics affecting how you see a hummingbird. And that's wonderful. So, it is this need, I think, to be, the word activism has kind of a dirty connotation to it for a lot of people, but I think it's to be active. It's to take part in something that is important to you, take part in conservation, take part in getting out messages, that are important to you during elections, and what you believe in, but in a good way that can win people over with, I think in part with emotions, with this common emotion we feel about certain things. It's like with writing a book. Nobody knows my life. Maybe, they're not raised in a Chinese family, but if you write with emotion, with beliefs, and these emotions are something that everybody shares. Everybody feels loss. Everybody feels hope and disappointment and love and and you find that commonality. They connect with a book about characters that are fictional, about families that are unlike theirs. And when they feel it at that deep, deep level, you're connected suddenly. And that's, I think, part of it. We need to find connections and not just the differences, the divides.
The first time that I read The Joy Luck Club, what stood out with me was this commitment to building and communicating across differences, across experiences and backgrounds, the multi-generational and intergenerational experience of trying to find some commonality, but also respecting one's history and one's elders and still being able to say, let's go forward. I hear some of those themes in the Backyard Bird Chronicles of being able to be together, respecting those around you. So you talk about, I'm observing the birds and the birds are observing me, that kind of communication and commitment.
Yeah.
How does communication show up for you in birding as you are
In
chronicling
birding.
that? Yeah.
Well, the first thing that I notice is that every time I look at a bird, it sees me. You may think that it doesn't see you, but it actually does. And sometimes they look directly at me, and that is such a thrill. But part of the communication is also that when I'm drawing, I have to imagine that I am the bird. Imagination, to me, is the closest we have to compassion. If we can imagine ourselves as the other person, as the bird, as something that is so out of uh, out of our usual world, it opens us up in a way that I think is surprising. So there I am. I had this wonderful teacher. He's still my mentor. And when I was learning to draw birds, his comment to the class was that you should try to imagine feeling the bird. You should imagine the life force of the bird. And me being a fiction writer, I could take it one step further into imagining I was the bird. I was the bird looking at me. What is the bird feeling looking at me? Probably a lot of wariness, maybe even fear, maybe wonderment that I've shown up at this place where no person, I'm a creature, flightless, no feathers, that I'm there. Maybe it is wondering if I have food. It's not wondering whether I'm edible and a little too big, but it's all that fun imagination, but real, so I could understand why a bird would fly away when it sees me. It's wired in some sense to fly away, sudden movements. But what if I sit still? Stillness is communication. Stillness. I'm there absolutely still. And after 5 minutes, the birds come. And they may look at me, but I'm not moving. And they kind of know. So I'm imagining the bird kind of know I'm a little too big and I don't have wings. I'm not going to be able to leap up and get them in a second. So they're pretty calm and they're on the bird feeder just there. Sometimes they look at me, sometimes they don't. And that's communication. They do their thing and I am just absolutely still watching. Sometimes I will have a bird land on me, hummingbirds typically, and I've also had chickadees and nuthatches. But I'll look at the bird, and if I talk softly to the bird, especially the hummingbirds, they will stay. And I'll just say, "Oh, you're so pretty. Oh, what a good boy you are. Are you hungry? Oh, look at you." And I'll just say it in that voice, and they look at me. They look up with those beautiful black eyes, and then they look back down and keep feeding. that is a communication. Body language, tension in your body, your facial expressions, all of that non-verbal communication comes into play. And we should recognize that we communicate to people on an unconscious level in the same way. The tension in our bodies, our movements, and the tenseness in our voices, the quality of our voices, not the words, but the qualities of these things, the speed in which we move. These are all part of our communication. Speed is threatening in many times, unless you're watching the Olympics, then you cheer for speed. But if somebody moves rapidly toward you, we have a little bit of wariness that especially in different contexts. So we can learn from the birds what are these nonverbal signals that are communicating something.
There's so many life lessons that you help elevate for us in this book and chronicling your journey and your experience. I will meditate on that notion you just said, that stillness is communication, particularly in a moment when I feel we are all so rushed and all so driven to feel like we have to go to the next thing, that we don't always allow ourselves to sit in that stillness and to think about how the stillness can allow us to connect more deeply with ourselves, but others. You also write about the power it would be if people saw birds as individuals. Can you talk more about that power?
I am a member of the board of American Bird Conservancy, which is concerned with species, the loss of species, and as it habitat that relates to that, or changes in the environment, or laws and everything. We're looking at species. We often think of going birding and saying, "Oh, there's a robin. Oh, there's a crow. There's a grosbeak," and they're just names of species, and we're so proud to find them. But if you slow down and you look at the same bird for a very long period of time, you get to know them, not as a species, but as an individual, a creature inhabiting the same space that you are inhabiting. You are a creature as well. And these individuals changed how I view wildlife, that I had to see it as um, part of my world, the sanctity of each individual life in my yard. And so it was good for me to mourn the loss of the lives. It was essential. And not just to mourn the loss of an entire species, that it begins with the individual. Our caring for birds, for species of birds, begins with falling in love with a single bird. It's the same with a lot of people with pets. They have a pet dog or cat. They fall in love with that animal. Then they get involved with rescue, dog rescue, cat rescue, or aligning themselves with other dog owners, or getting very territorial about their dogs. And, there are things that can happen that are still very territorial in that. But, I like to focus on the things about individual birds, about the appreciation for the individual that leads into a greater love for birds in general, for their lives, the sanctity of their lives, and the fact that they do belong in our world, that they are necessary, that creature belongs in our world just as much as we belong in the world.
Coming up, more with author Amy Tan. She'll talk about her upcoming novel and how it was shaped by her own life. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Khalilah-Brown Dean. Today I'm talking with Amy Tan, author of best-selling novels like The Joy Luck Club and The Bone Setter's Daughter. Amy's latest book is called The Backyard Bird Chronicles. It collects drawings and writings from her nature journals. I asked Amy what observing nature has taught her to observe about herself.
I always thought that I was very observant to begin with because I'm a writer. And it started off when I was a child, being observant of human behavior. My mother was very volatile and she could spin off into a suicidal rage at any moment. So I had to pay attention. And I would pay attention to other people and circumstances. But again, it was like looking down in the creek and never looking up, never looking out farther than what was fairly close to me. And I realized that I had to look farther. I had to take into account many more factors that are out in the world, even when writing fiction, that I'm aware of the world in a different way. You mentioned seasons. I'm aware now of how life changes during seasons. I don't see the uh, calendar as much in terms of months as I do seasons now. And that has to do with the context of what happens with life during that period. Well, you have to think also about context of seasons with people as well, especially during times when people are working, people who are working out in the outdoors. One of my goddaughter, one of her parents, her father, was a migrant worker, and he was working in the fields from the time he was 4 in the hot sun. And he talks about what that is. Well, a lot of us, we stay indoors in air conditioning when it's really hot, and or we go to shady places. We're not, out there picking garlic in the sun. But there are people that's true. That they do have to, you know, seasons make a difference. Seasons also bring in work. So we're conscious then of all these other aspects of our environment, our world, that do impact other people. So that became an enlargement in my life that I appreciate so much. It will be part of my observations that go into my fiction from now on. It makes my work, I think, richer.
I appreciate how you talk about how those two streams of your passion feed one another. I have to say to our listeners, this is one of the most beautiful books I've encountered in a very long time. There are 132 illustrations created by Amy Tan. And yet, through your words, you also paint another layer to those pictures and to those experiences. I know we're not supposed to ask writers this, but I have to ask it. What's the next project? Given the beauty of this piece, will you continue to do more of that? Or will it be this kind of space for Amy Tan that doesn't have to fit convention?
I'm always trying to do something new. As I said, it's a goal in my life, constant goal to discover something new. And so even if I'm doing the same thing, like writing another novel, there has to be something new in there. I have to go to a new place. And so, yes, it is. But during the time that I'm writing, it has to be very private. And that means not even saying what it's about so much, except that every single novel, and I think this is true for all writers, does somehow reflect what's going on in your life and the things that you think about and what's important. It may not be obvious to people because the story may be about something completely different, but our lives, we're the channel for that story, and it includes everything happening with us. So a lot of people, for example, during the election, during COVID, got derailed because this is affecting what you're thinking about at the same time. Some people ended up writing about 9/11 or about political divide or about, what's happening in the rest of the world. We write about isolation because of the pandemic. And I'm the same way. What I was writing in my novel when I began suddenly became less relevant. I could still write it, but I had to include in that novel things that I had discovered during this period in the intervening years. And so the book is somewhat the same. The characters are somewhat the same, but now it's different. The perspective, the angle got shifted. And now this character is looking also more widely, not simply in her world. These characters are often, the main characters are often, it's as though I am the character, just like I am the bird. And I'm looking at the things around me and what's happening. So my view as the character is wider, and it includes a lot of things that are very ugly as well as very beautiful. That's as much as I can say. That it is a much, it's got some, I think there's something about my voice, people say, that is very recognizable. The voice has a lot to do with what I observe and what I believe and think and feel. And that is always going to be the case in any fiction that I write. But I think the perspective is going to take me farther.
Your voice is relatable, and it's also relational, so that people are able to see pieces of their own experience in your stories, but it also challenges them to think and to imagine and to appreciate very differently. My very last question to you in this conversation, which I hate to see come to a close because I feel like I could just talk to you about this all the time. My very last question to you is when you think about nature and the beauty that is around us, but also the changes and the challenges, what is the thing that you most look forward to? The start of the day when you go out to encounter nature, what's the thing you most look forward to?
I look forward to seeing the first bird and who that bird is going to be. I often hear the song first. And that is like the clarion call for the start of the day. And they come sometimes within minutes or seconds. They can see me. They're hidden in the tree. Hidden meaning I can't see them, but they see me and they start to come down and they'll land on the fence and look at me. And it just starts the day in this really beautiful note. That a bird has come, and you could think of it in anthropomorphic ways. The bird has come to say hello, good morning. The feeling is like that, but the bird has come actually because it knows I'm bringing some food. But that's good too. It understands who I am in its context. The other bird, the other thing, for 8 months or almost a year, every morning, my husband would go outside and then he'd come back and bring me my coffee. And I'd say, is Junior there? Is Mom there? And those were the 2 owls that had come to live in our yard in the tree. We could look up from our dining room and we could look out standing on our veranda up from the office and we could see these owls, a mother and her young son. What a great way to start the day. And it was this predictable as sunrise and sunset. They left at sunset. What a thrill. Apparently they have come back, not the same mom and son, but the mate of the son and the mate's young son. So it's another boy. Boys are smaller. Great horned owls. The females are bigger. So you know that it's a boy. And that is my morning prayer. Good morning. Good morning, creatures. Good morning, birds. And good morning to the world. I'm here to take it all in.
What a gift that you are able to write the stories of generations and see generations in your own very backyard. Amy Tan is a best-selling author. Her newest book is called The Backyard Bird Chronicles, and it's based on her nature journals. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, and Meg Dalton. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. I'm Khalilah-Brown Dean. Here's to new beginnings.